The security camera footage would later become evidence in one of the most talked-about incidents in royal protection history. It showed a single figure standing motionless in the bitter December wind, while behind reinforced doors, two of the world's most powerful women faced off in a confrontation that would change everything. What the cameras couldn't capture was the internal struggle of Marcus Henderson, a 34-year-old protection officer whose split-second decision to follow protocol would thrust him into an international spotlight he never wanted. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees Celsius that night, but it wasn't the cold that made Marcus's hands shake as he stood guard outside Kensington Palace. It was the knowledge that his next move could either save a life or end his career. Inside, Princess Charlotte had collapsed during what witnesses described as a heated family discussion, and Camilla, the queen consort, was demanding immediate exit from the building. But Marcus had his orders, and 20 years of military and security training had taught him that orders existed for a reason. What happened next would be dissected by media outlets across 6 continents, debated in Parliament, and ultimately reveal the hidden tensions within the most scrutinized family on Earth. This is the true story of the night when duty collided with desperation, when protocol met panic, and when one man's refusal to step aside exposed secrets that the palace had spent decades keeping buried. The story begins not with the incident itself, but 3 months earlier, when Marcus Henderson received the assignment that would define the rest of his life. Marcus Henderson had served in 3 war zones before he ever set foot in Kensington Palace, but nothing had prepared him for the complex battlefield of royal family dynamics. The morning he received his reassignment from the Metropolitan Police's Specialist Protection Unit, he thought it would be the easiest job of his career. He was wrong in ways he couldn't have imagined. The call came on a crisp September morning while Marcus was finishing his weekly firearms recertification at the Hendon training facility. His commanding officer, Chief Inspector David Morrison, delivered the news with characteristic directness. Marcus would be joining the close protection detail for the younger members of the royal family, specifically focusing on Princess Charlotte and Prince George during their transition into more public roles. At 34, Marcus brought an impressive resume to the assignment. He had served 8 years in the British Army's Special Air Service, including deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq. After leaving the military, he spent 6 years with Scotland Yard's counter-terrorism unit before moving to specialist protection. His psychological evaluations consistently rated him as calm under pressure, adaptable to changing circumstances, and absolutely reliable in following established protocols. The briefing process took 3 weeks and involved layers of security clearance that Marcus had never encountered, even in military intelligence. He learned about threat assessment matrices specific to each family member, evacuation protocols for dozens of different scenarios, and the intricate web of relationships that governed every aspect of royal life. What surprised him most was how much of the job involved managing not external threats, but internal tensions. His training supervisor, Commander Sarah Walsh, had worked royal protection for 15 years and spoke with the weary wisdom of someone who had seen too much. During one of their sessions at the secure facility in Vauxhall, she pulled Marcus aside for what she called the conversation that isn't in any manual. "You'll hear things," she told him, her voice low despite the soundproofed room. Family arguments, personal struggles, conversations that could fill tabloid headlines for months. Your job isn't to judge, isn't to take sides, and definitely isn't to share. But there's something else you need to understand. Sometimes the biggest threat to these people isn't some external enemy. Sometimes it's each other. Marcus didn't fully grasp what she meant until his 3rd week on the job. He was stationed outside a private meeting room in Kensington Palace, while Princess Charlotte, then 8 years old, had what was described as a routine consultation with a child psychologist. The meeting was supposed to last an hour. It stretched to 3, and Marcus could hear raised voices through the heavy oak doors, though not the specific words. When the door finally opened, Charlotte emerged with red-rimmed eyes, followed by her mother Catherine, who looked pale and drawn. The psychologist, Dr. Rebecca Mills, spoke briefly with Catherine in hushed tones before departing. Marcus maintained his professional composure, but he filed away the incident in his growing understanding that this family's challenges went far beyond the public scrutiny they faced. The first major incident occurred 6 weeks into Marcus's assignment. The family was attending a private charity event at the Natural History Museum. an evening affair that was supposed to be routine. Charlotte had been having what her parents diplomatically called adjustment issues, related to increased public attention and academic pressures at her new school. The event was meant to be therapeutic, a chance for her to engage with causes she cared about in a controlled environment. Everything went wrong from the moment they arrived. Charlotte, overwhelmed by the crowds and camera flashes, became withdrawn and anxious. Marcus watched as she pressed herself against her mother's side, her small hands gripping Catherine's dress with white-knuckled intensity. Prince William tried to ease the situation by suggesting they move to a quieter section of the museum, but the logistics of royal security meant that even this simple request required coordination among multiple teams. As they made their way through the dinosaur exhibits, Charlotte suddenly broke away from her parents and ran. In the controlled chaos that followed, Marcus found himself making his first critical decision. Protocol dictated that he should immediately alert the full security team and initiate lockdown procedures. Instead, he quietly followed Charlotte while radioing her location to other officers, keeping the situation contained and discreet. He found her sitting on the floor behind a display case featuring a family of triceratops, tears streaming down her face. She looked up at him with the mixture of defiance and vulnerability that he would come to recognize as her default expression during difficult moments. "I just wanted them to stop looking at me," she said, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the museum. Marcus knelt down to her level, breaking another protocol about maintaining physical distance from the principals. "I know," he said simply. "Sometimes being watched all the time gets exhausting." They sat together in silence for several minutes before Catherine and William arrived, flanked by other protection officers. The relief on Catherine's face was palpable, but Marcus noticed something else there too. A look of gratitude, but also of recognition. She understood that Marcus had handled the situation with more than just professional competence. He had shown genuine care for Charlotte's emotional well-being. The incident report Marcus filed that night was deliberately minimal, focusing on the successful resolution rather than the underlying causes. But privately, he began to understand that protecting these children meant more than just keeping them physically safe. It meant understanding their emotional needs, recognizing their breaking points, and sometimes making judgment calls that weren't covered in any training manual. Over the following weeks, Marcus noticed changes in how Charlotte interacted with him. She would catch his eye during particularly stressful public appearances, seeking reassurance that he was there. During private moments, she would sometimes make small talk, testing the boundaries of their relationship. Marcus maintained his professional demeanor, but he began to see her not just as a principal to be protected, but as a child navigating an impossible situation. The complexity of his role became even more apparent during a family dinner at Kensington Palace in late October. Marcus was positioned outside the private dining room, monitoring security feeds and maintaining radio contact with the perimeter team. The dinner was supposed to be a celebration of Prince George's recent academic achievements, but it quickly devolved into something darker. Through the monitoring system, Marcus could hear fragments of conversation that revealed deep tensions within the family. There were discussions about Charlotte's behavioral issues, debates about the level of public exposure appropriate for the children, and underlying currents of disagreement about parenting approaches. William's voice carried notes of frustration, while Catherine sounded increasingly defensive. But it was Camilla's contribution to the conversation that caught Marcus's attention. The Queen Consort had strong opinions about how the children should be managed, opinions that clearly conflicted with William and Catherine's more protective approach. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and Marcus could sense the tension rising as the evening progressed. Charlotte's voice, when it appeared in the conversation, was small and uncertain. She was trying to explain something about school, but kept being interrupted or redirected by the adults. Marcus found himself gripping his radio tighter, fighting the urge to intervene in a situation that was outside his jurisdiction, but clearly distressing to the child he was assigned to protect. The dinner ended abruptly when Charlotte apparently became upset and left the table. Marcus heard rapid footsteps in the hallway, followed by a door slamming. A few minutes later, Catherine emerged from the dining room, her composed public face firmly in place despite the obvious stress in her eyes. "Charlotte isn't feeling well," she told Marcus, though they both knew it was more complicated than that. "She's gone to her room. Could you please make sure the corridor remains secure?" Marcus nodded and took up position outside Charlotte's bedroom door. For the next hour, He could hear muffled crying and occasional outbursts of frustration. When Catherine came to check on her daughter, Marcus stepped aside, but remained close enough to hear fragments of their conversation. "I don't want to do it anymore," Charlotte was saying. "I don't want people always watching me, always expecting things. I just want to be normal." Catherine's response was patient, but firm. "I know it's hard, sweetheart, but this is our life, and we have to find ways to make it work. You're stronger than you think you are." "But what if I'm not?" Charlotte asked. "What if I can't be what everyone wants me to be?" The question hung in the air, and Marcus realized he was hearing something that went to the heart of the royal family's deepest challenges. These weren't just public figures dealing with media attention. These were real people, including children, struggling with the weight of expectations that most people couldn't imagine. As autumn turned to winter, Marcus began to see patterns in the family's dynamics. Charlotte's difficult behavior seemed to correlate with increased public scrutiny or family tensions. William and Catherine were clearly doing their best to provide stability, but they were operating under constraints that made normal parenting nearly impossible. And underlying everything was a complex web of relationships within the extended royal family that created additional pressure on everyone involved. The breaking point came in early December, during what was supposed to be a routine weekend at Kensington Palace. King Charles and Camilla were visiting to discuss upcoming holiday arrangements, a meeting that should have been straightforward but quickly became contentious. The disagreement centered on Charlotte's participation in various Christmas events, with Camilla pushing for a higher-profile role and William and Catherine advocating for a more limited schedule. Marcus was positioned in his usual spot outside the main reception room when he heard voices rising. The discussion had moved beyond polite disagreement into something approaching an argument. Charlotte was present for part of the meeting, and Marcus could hear her becoming increasingly agitated as the adults debated her future without really consulting her preferences. What happened next would set in motion the events that would define Marcus's career and expose the royal family's internal struggles to unprecedented scrutiny. Charlotte, overwhelmed by the pressure and attention, suffered what medical professionals would later describe as an anxiety-induced collapse. In the chaos that followed, as medical personnel were summoned and family members struggled to respond, Camilla demanded to leave the palace immediately. And that's when Marcus Henderson, following protocols that seemed inadequate for the situation unfolding around him, made the decision that would change everything. He refused to let her go. The sound Charlotte made when she collapsed wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a gasp. It was something Marcus had heard before in combat zones, the sound of a human nervous system reaching its absolute limit. He was monitoring the security feeds when it happened, watching the infrared signatures of the people in the reception room through his tactical display. One moment Charlotte's heat signature was upright and moving. The next it was crumpled on the floor. Marcus's training kicked in immediately. He activated the medical emergency protocol, alerting the on-site paramedic team and notifying the backup units stationed around the perimeter. But even as his hands moved through the practiced motions of emergency response, his mind was processing something more complex. This wasn't a random medical incident. This was the culmination of months of pressure that he had watched building like a storm system. Inside the reception room, chaos erupted. Through the security feed, Marcus could see William dropping to his knees beside his daughter, while Catherine frantically checked her pulse. King Charles stepped back, his face pale, while Camilla moved toward the door with quick, agitated steps. The family's carefully maintained composure had shattered in an instant, revealing the raw emotions underneath. Dr. Amanda Foster, the palace's on-call physician, arrived within 3 minutes. Marcus maintained his position as she rushed past him into the reception room, her medical bag in hand. Through the slightly open door, he could hear fragments of her assessment. Charlotte was conscious but hyperventilating, her pulse rapid and irregular. Foster's calm voice provided a steady counterpoint to the family's distress as she worked to stabilize the young princess. It was during these crucial first minutes that Camilla made her first attempt to leave. She approached Marcus with the imperious manner that came naturally to someone who had spent years in positions of authority. Her face was composed, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders and the rapid pulse at her throat. "I need to leave immediately," she told him. her voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Have my car brought around now." Marcus looked at her steadily, his training warring with his instincts. Protocol was clear about lockdown procedures during medical emergencies involving primary family members. No one entered or left until the situation was fully assessed and contained. But protocol didn't account for the Queen Consort's obvious distress or her clear desire to distance herself from whatever was happening with Charlotte. "Ma'am, I need to maintain security protocols until we have a full assessment of the situation," Marcus replied, his voice respectful but firm. "Dr. Foster is with Princess Charlotte now, and we should have more information shortly." Camilla's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or panic. "You don't understand. I cannot be here right now. This is not my responsibility, and my presence is not helping anyone." The words hung between them, revealing more than Camilla probably intended. Marcus realized that whatever had transpired in that reception room before Charlotte's collapse, the Queen Consort felt somehow responsible or implicated. Her desire to leave wasn't just about avoiding an uncomfortable situation. It was about avoiding accountability for whatever role she might have played. "I understand your concern, ma'am," Marcus said carefully. "But my orders are to maintain the security of all individuals in the building during any medical emergency. I cannot authorize departures until the all-clear is given." Inside the reception room, Dr. Sepsu Foster was working to calm Charlotte's breathing while explaining the situation to her parents. Marcus could hear fragments of the conversation through his earpiece, which was monitoring the medical team's communications. Charlotte was experiencing what appeared to be a severe panic attack, triggered by stress and exhaustion. The doctor was recommending immediate rest and a reduction in stimulating activities. Camilla tried a different approach, her voice taking on a more conciliatory tone. "Officer Henderson, I appreciate your dedication to protocol, but surely you can see that my departure would actually improve the situation. The child clearly needs space, and having fewer people around might help her recovery." There was logic to her argument, but Marcus had spent enough time observing family dynamics to understand that Camilla's sudden departure might actually complicate things further. If she left now, it would look like she was fleeing responsibility, potentially creating additional stress for William and Catherine, who would have to manage both Charlotte's condition and the political implications of Camilla's absence. "Ma'am, I think it would be best if you remained available in case Dr. Foster or the family needs to discuss what happened," Marcus replied. "Perhaps you could wait in the blue drawing room while Princess Charlotte receives medical attention?" The suggestion was reasonable and provided Camilla with a dignified way to step back from the immediate situation without actually leaving. But instead of accepting the compromise, Camilla's composure began to crack. Her voice rose slightly, carrying undertones of desperation that Marcus found unsettling. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said. "This situation requires delicate handling, and my presence here will only make things worse. I am not asking for your permission to leave. I am telling you that I am leaving." She moved toward the main entrance, but Marcus stepped subtly to block her path. It wasn't an aggressive movement, but it was unmistakably deliberate. He kept his hands visible and his posture non-threatening, but his message was clear. He would not allow her to leave. "Ma'am, I cannot permit that," he said quietly. "Please understand that this is not personal. I am following established protocols that are designed to protect everyone's safety and security." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by William's emergence from the reception room. The future king looked haggard, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his face creased with worry. He took in the scene immediately, recognizing the tension between Marcus and his stepmother. "What's happening here?" William asked, his voice carrying the strain of the past hour. Camilla turned to him with visible relief, clearly expecting him to resolve the situation in her favor. "I was just explaining to Officer Henderson that I need to leave immediately. This situation requires careful management, and my presence here is counterproductive." William studied her face for a long moment, and Marcus could see him processing not just her words, but the implications behind them. Whatever had happened in that reception room before Charlotte's collapse, William was clearly aware of the dynamics involved. "Camilla," William said slowly, "I think it would be better if you stayed until we understand what triggered Charlotte's episode. Foster may need to ask questions about the conversation that preceded her collapse." The words were diplomatically phrased, but Marcus caught the underlying message. William suspected that Camilla's behavior had contributed to Charlotte's distress, and he wanted her available for accountability, not fleeing the scene. Camilla's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, anger, and finally something that looked like fear. "William, you know that's not necessary." Charlotte simply became overwrought. "These things happen with sensitive children." "Do they?" William asked, his voice carrying a sharp edge that Marcus had never heard before. "Because Charlotte has been increasingly anxious lately, and it seems to correlate with certain family interactions. The accusation was subtle but unmistakable." William was suggesting that Camilla's approach to Charlotte was contributing to the child's emotional distress. Marcus realized he was witnessing a confrontation that went far beyond this single incident, touching on deeper issues within the family's dynamics. Dr. Foster appeared in the doorway, her professional demeanor intact despite the obvious tension she was walking into. "Princess Charlotte is stable now," she announced. "Her breathing has normalized and her pulse is returning to normal ranges. However, I would like to discuss the circumstances that led to this episode." She looked around the group, her experienced eyes taking in the body language and facial expressions that told a story beyond Charlotte's immediate medical needs. "I understand there was a family discussion in progress when the episode occurred. It would be helpful if I could speak with everyone who was present to get a complete picture of potential triggers." Camilla's face went pale at the doctor's words. The prospect of a medical professional investigating the circumstances of Charlotte's collapse clearly alarmed her. Marcus watched as she made one more attempt to extract herself from the situation. "Doctor, I'm sure you understand that family discussions sometimes involve sensitive topics," Camilla said, her voice carefully controlled. "My recollection of events may not be particularly helpful, and I have other commitments that require my attention." Dr. Foster's expression didn't change, but Marcus caught a subtle shift in her posture that suggested she was not impressed by Camilla's evasiveness. "Ma'am, when a child experiences this type of acute stress response, it's important to identify all contributing factors. This isn't about assigning blame, it's about preventing future episodes." The doctor's words were professional and measured, but they carried an implicit criticism of anyone who would prioritize their own convenience over a child's well-being. Marcus saw William's jaw tighten as he recognized the same implication. "Camilla will be staying until we've completed the assessment," William said firmly. "Charlotte's health is the priority here, and we need to understand everything that contributed to this incident. It was a direct order from the future king, but Camilla's response suggested she was not accustomed to being overruled, even by William." She turned back to Marcus with renewed determination, apparently deciding that the protection officer represented the weakest link in the chain keeping her confined. "Officer Henderson," she said, her voice taking on formal tones, "I am instructing you to arrange my immediate departure. As Queen Consort, I outrank everyone else in this building, and I am giving you a direct command." The invocation of royal hierarchy put Marcus in an impossible position. Technically, Camilla was correct about the chain of command, but his specific orders regarding emergency protocols came from a different authority structure, one that prioritized security over royal precedence. More importantly, his instincts told him that allowing Camilla to leave now would be wrong on multiple levels. Marcus looked at William, seeking guidance, but the prince's expression was unreadable. This was clearly a moment that would define relationships within the family for years to come, and Marcus realized that his next words would be crucial not just for his own career, but for Charlotte's future well-being. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "with respect, my orders regarding security protocols during medical emergencies are absolute. They cannot be overruled by anyone present in the building, regardless of rank or title. I must ask you to remain until the situation is fully resolved." The words created a moment of absolute silence. Marcus had effectively told the Queen Consort that her authority had limits, that there were circumstances where duty and protocol took precedence over royal privilege. It was a line that few people in his position had ever dared to cross. Camilla's face went through a range of emotions before settling on cold fury. "Are you seriously telling me that you, a security guard, are going to prevent me, the Queen Consort of the United Kingdom, from leaving this building?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied simply. "That is exactly what I'm telling you." The temperature outside Kensington Palace had dropped to -12 degrees Celsius by the time Marcus Henderson found himself standing alone in the main entrance hall, watching Camilla pace like a caged animal. 3 hours had passed since Charlotte's collapse, and what had started as a medical emergency was rapidly evolving into a constitutional crisis that nobody had anticipated or prepared for. Dr. Foster had completed her initial assessment and moved Charlotte to her private quarters for extended observation. The young princess was physically stable but emotionally fragile, drifting in and out of an exhausted sleep while her parents maintained a bedside vigil. Catherine hadn't left Charlotte's side since the incident, while William moved between his daughter's room and hushed conversations with palace officials who were trying to understand the implications of the evening's events. Marcus remained at his post, but the nature of his duties had shifted dramatically. He was no longer just protecting the royal family from external threats. He had become the physical embodiment of accountability, preventing Camilla from escaping a situation that she had apparently played a role in creating. The weight of that responsibility was unlike anything he had experienced in his military or security career. Camilla had tried several different approaches to change his mind. First came the appeals to reason, arguments about how her departure would actually benefit everyone involved. When that failed, she moved to veiled threats about his career prospects and the consequences of defying royal authority. Now she had settled into a pattern of alternating between cold silence and bitter commentary about the situation's absurdity. "Do you realize," she said during one of their tense exchanges, "that you are effectively holding the Queen Consort of the United Kingdom under house arrest? Do you understand the precedent this sets?" Marcus had considered that question extensively over the past few hours. The precedent was indeed significant, but not for the reasons Camilla was suggesting. He was establishing that royal privilege had limits when it conflicted with child welfare and basic accountability. It was a precedent that probably should have been set decades earlier. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration," Marcus replied, "but my primary concern is ensuring that everyone involved in this incident remains available to provide information that might be crucial for Princess Charlotte's ongoing care and safety." The diplomatic language masked a darker reality that both of them understood.
Marcus wasn't just keeping Camilla available for medical consultations.
He was ensuring that she couldn't flee before anyone had a chance to examine her role in Charlotte's emotional breakdown. The implications went far beyond this single incident, touching on patterns of behavior that might have been affecting Charlotte for months or years. Around midnight, King Charles arrived unannounced, accompanied by a small security detail and an air of barely controlled tension. Marcus watched through the security monitors as the king's car pulled up to the private entrance, followed by 2 additional vehicles carrying what appeared to be senior palace officials. The cavalry was arriving, and Marcus realized that his quiet stand in the entrance hall was about to become the center of a much larger storm. Charles entered the building with the measured pace of someone who had spent a lifetime managing crises, but Marcus could see the strain in his posture and the tight lines around his eyes. The king nodded to Marcus professionally, acknowledging his presence without comment, before proceeding directly to where Camilla was waiting in the blue drawing room. Their reunion was not what Marcus had expected. Instead of the relief and support that might normally characterize a husband's arrival during a difficult situation, there was a coolness between them that suggested Charles was not entirely sympathetic to Camilla's predicament. Their conversation, conducted in low tones behind closed doors, seemed more like a debriefing than a comfort session. Marcus maintained his position but activated his earpiece to monitor the security feeds from the drawing room. The palace's surveillance system was comprehensive, and his access allowed him to observe without directly eavesdropping. What he saw told a story that words might have concealed. Charles's body language suggested interrogation rather than support. He sat across from Camilla rather than beside her, his posture formal and his gestures controlled. Camilla's responses appeared defensive, her hands moving in explanatory gestures that seemed designed to minimize or justify something. There were moments when Charles's expression hardened, suggesting that Camilla's explanations were not entirely satisfactory. After 30 minutes, Charles emerged from the drawing room and approached Marcus directly. The king's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that might have been resignation or disappointment. "Officer Henderson," Charles said quietly, "I understand you've been maintaining security protocols during this incident." "Yes, Your Majesty," Marcus replied. standard procedure for medical emergencies involving primary family members. Charles studied him for a moment, and Marcus had the sense that he was being evaluated not just as a security officer, but as a person whose judgment and character were being assessed in real time. "I've spoken with Dr. Foster about Charlotte's condition," Charles continued. "She's indicated that understanding the full context of this evening's events is important for Charlotte's ongoing treatment and well-being." The words were carefully chosen, but Marcus understood their significance. Charles was essentially endorsing Marcus's decision to keep Camilla available for questioning. The king was supporting the security officer's authority over his own wife's preferences, a choice that revealed deep currents of family tension that the public never saw. "Dr. Foster has requested interviews with everyone who was present during the family discussion that preceded Charlotte's collapse," Charles said. "I trust you'll continue to ensure that all necessary parties remain available for those conversations." It was both an instruction and a validation. Charles was formally authorizing Marcus to continue preventing Camilla's departure, removing any ambiguity about the authority behind his actions. More importantly, it suggested that Charles was more concerned about his granddaughter's well-being than about his wife's comfort or reputation. "Of course, Your Majesty," Marcus replied. "I'll maintain current protocols until Dr. Foster completes her assessment." Charles nodded and moved toward Charlotte's quarters to check on her condition and consult with William and Catherine. Marcus was left to contemplate the extraordinary situation he found himself in. He was no longer just a security officer following emergency protocols. He had become an agent of accountability in a family system that historically had few mechanisms for holding its most powerful members responsible for their actions. The night deepened, and Marcus found his thoughts turning to the broader implications of what was happening. Charlotte's collapse wasn't an isolated incident. It was the visible manifestation of pressures and tensions that had been building for months. His decision to prevent Camilla's departure was forcing a confrontation that might have been avoided indefinitely if he had simply stepped aside and allowed her to leave. Around 2 a.m, Dr. Foster emerged from Charlotte's quarters and requested a private conference with all the adults who had been present during the incident. This included William, Catherine, Charles, and Camilla, who was summoned from the drawing room with obvious reluctance. Marcus was asked to remain nearby in case security concerns arose during the discussion. The meeting took place in William's private office, a room that Marcus had secured but couldn't monitor directly. However, the building's acoustics and his position in the adjacent hallway allowed him to hear fragments of what was clearly a difficult conversation. Dr. Foster's voice was professional but firm as she outlined Charlotte's condition and the factors that had contributed to her collapse. The medical assessment was comprehensive, covering not just the immediate incident but patterns of stress and anxiety that had been developing over time. Princess Charlotte has been experiencing chronic stress responses for several months, Dr. Foster explained. These have manifested as sleep disturbances, appetite changes, and increased emotional volatility. Tonight's incident represents an acute escalation of an ongoing condition. William's voice carried notes of concern and frustration. What's causing this chronic stress? We've tried to maintain as normal an environment as possible given the circumstances of our lives. Dr. Foster's response was measured but pointed. Children are extremely sensitive to adult tensions and conflicts, even when those conflicts are not directly expressed in their presence. Charlotte appears to be internalizing stress from family dynamics that she doesn't fully understand but can sense are problematic. The implication was clear. Charlotte's emotional distress was not the result of external pressures like media attention or public scrutiny. It was coming from within the family itself, from tensions and conflicts between the adults who were supposed to provide her with stability and security. Camilla's voice entered the conversation for the first time, carrying defensive tones. Children Charlotte's age often experience anxiety. It's a normal part of development, especially for children in high-pressure situations. That's true, Dr. Foster replied. However, Charlotte's stress markers suggest exposure to specific triggers that are both recurring and escalating. Tonight's episode was precipitated by a family discussion about her future obligations and public role. Her physical response suggests that these discussions have become a source of significant anxiety for her. The room fell silent, and Marcus could almost feel the weight of accountability settling over the participants. Someone in that room had been pushing Charlotte beyond her emotional limits, and Dr. Foster's clinical assessment was forcing them to confront that reality. William's voice, when it came, was tight with controlled anger. "Are you saying that our family discussions about Charlotte's role have been traumatizing her?" "I'm saying that Charlotte is experiencing these discussions as overwhelming and threatening." "Doctor," Foster replied, "children her age lack the cognitive tools to process complex expectations about duty and obligation. When those expectations are presented in ways that feel coercive or inflexible, the result can be exactly what we saw tonight." Marcus realized that Dr. Foster was diplomatically describing what might be characterized more bluntly as emotional abuse. Someone had been pressuring Charlotte to accept responsibilities and obligations that she wasn't developmentally ready to handle, and tonight that pressure had reached a breaking point. Charles's voice carried a note of weary authority when he spoke. "Foster, what are your recommendations for Charlotte's ongoing care and our family's interactions with her?" The doctor's response was comprehensive and pointed. Charlotte needed immediate reduction in pressure regarding her public role, therapy to process her anxiety responses, and changes in how family discussions about her future were conducted. Most importantly, she needed protection from adults who might prioritize institutional needs over her emotional well-being. The meeting continued for another hour, but Marcus had heard enough to understand the significance of what was happening. A medical professional was essentially conducting an intervention with one of the world's most powerful families, forcing them to confront patterns of behavior that had been damaging a vulnerable child. When the participants finally emerged from William's office, the dynamics between them had clearly shifted. Charles looked grave and resolute, William appeared angry but determined, and Catherine seemed relieved that someone had finally given voice to concerns she had probably harbored for months. Camilla emerged last, her composed facade intact, but her eyes carrying something that might have been fear or resentment. She looked at Marcus with an expression that suggested she held him personally responsible for the evening's revelations, as if his refusal to let her leave had forced an accounting that she would have preferred to avoid. "Doctor?" Foster approached Marcus as the family members dispersed to various parts of the building. Her expression was professional but warm, and she spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had just delivered difficult truths to powerful people. "Officer Henderson," she said, "I want you to know that your actions tonight may have prevented a much more serious crisis. By ensuring that all parties remained available for assessment, you helped create the conditions for an intervention that Charlotte desperately needed." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of the night's events settling over him. He had made a choice to prioritize a child's well-being over royal privilege, and that choice had exposed problems that went far beyond a single incident. The consequences of that decision were only beginning to unfold. Dawn broke over London with the kind of pale, uncertain light that seemed appropriate for a morning when everything had changed. Marcus Henderson had been awake for 22 hours straight, sustained by coffee and the adrenaline that comes from making decisions that alter the trajectory of lives far more important than your own. As he watched the sun rise through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, he realized that his career, his reputation, and possibly his future hung in the balance of choices he had made in defense of an 8-year-old girl. Charlotte had slept fitfully through the night, waking several times with what Catherine described as nightmares. Dr. Foster remained on site, monitoring her condition and adjusting her treatment plan based on the ongoing assessment. The young princess was physically recovering, but the emotional damage would require months of careful therapy and significant changes in how her family approached her role within the institution. Marcus had maintained his position throughout the night, evolving from a security officer following protocol into something more complex. He had become a witness to family secrets, a guardian of accountability, and inadvertently, a catalyst for changes that the royal family had been avoiding for years. The weight of that responsibility was unlike anything his military training had prepared him for. At 6 a.m, Commander Sarah Walsh arrived unannounced, accompanied by Chief Inspector Morrison and 2 other senior officers from the Specialist Protection Unit. Marcus watched their approach through the security monitors, noting the grim expressions and formal postures that suggested this was not a routine check on his well-being. They were here to assess whether he had overstepped his authority and possibly to relieve him of his duties. The meeting took place in the palace's security office, a windowless room filled with monitors and communication equipment that felt like a command bunker. Marcus stood at attention while his superiors reviewed the night's incident reports, medical assessments, and witness statements. Their expressions revealed nothing, but the thoroughness of their inquiry suggested that his actions were being evaluated at the highest levels of the protection service. Commander Walsh spoke first, her voice carrying the measured tones of someone who had spent years navigating the complex politics of royal security. Officer Henderson, we need to understand the decision-making process that led you to prevent the Queen Consort from leaving Kensington Palace last night. Marcus had prepared for this moment throughout the night, but facing the actual inquiry was more intimidating than he had anticipated. These people held his career in their hands, and his explanation needed to satisfy not just security protocols, but the complex political considerations that governed royal protection. "Ma'am, Princess Charlotte suffered a medical emergency during a family meeting," Marcus began. "Standard protocol requires maintaining building security and ensuring all parties remain available for medical assessment and potential investigation. The Queen Consort requested departure before the situation was fully evaluated." "And you determined that her departure would compromise security protocols?" Chief Inspector Morrison asked. "Yes, sir." Dr. Foster indicated that understanding the circumstances preceding Princess Charlotte's collapse was crucial for her ongoing treatment. The Queen Consort was present during those circumstances and therefore needed to remain available for medical consultation. The explanation was factually accurate, but Marcus knew it didn't capture the full complexity of his decision. He had prevented Camilla's departure not just because of protocol, but because his instincts told him that allowing her to flee would have been a betrayal of Charlotte's well-being and a failure of his fundamental duty to protect those in his care. Commander Walsh studied him carefully. "Officer Henderson, the Queen Consort has filed a formal complaint alleging that you exceeded your authority and subjected her to unlawful detention. She's claiming that your actions were motivated by personal prejudice rather than legitimate security concerns." The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Camilla was not only trying to escape accountability for her role in Charlotte's distress, she was attempting to destroy his career in the process. The injustice of it was breathtaking, but Marcus forced himself to respond with the same professional composure he had maintained throughout the night. "Sir, my actions were based entirely on established emergency protocols, and my assessment of what was necessary to protect Princess Charlotte's well-being and security. Personal considerations played no role in my decision-making." "Can you prove that?" Morrison asked bluntly. Before Marcus could respond, there was a knock on the security office door. William entered without waiting for permission, his presence immediately changing the dynamic of the room. The future king looked like he had aged years overnight, but his expression carried a determination that Marcus had rarely seen in their previous interactions.
"I'm sorry to interrupt," William said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all.
"But I believe I can provide some context for your assessment of Officer Henderson's actions." Commander Walsh and Chief Inspector Morrison exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about how to handle a senior royal's intervention in a disciplinary proceeding. William took advantage of their hesitation to continue speaking. "Last night, Dr. Foster provided my family with a comprehensive assessment of my daughter's condition and the factors that contributed to her collapse," William said. "Her professional opinion is that Officer Henderson's actions were not only appropriate, but potentially life-saving." He pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be Dr. Foster's official report. The doctor's assessment indicates that Charlotte has been suffering from chronic stress related to family pressures about her public role. Last night's incident was an acute manifestation of ongoing emotional abuse that could have resulted in severe psychological damage if it had continued unchecked. The word abuse hung in the air like a bombshell. William had just formally accused someone in his own family of emotionally abusing his daughter, and he was crediting Marcus with preventing the situation from escalating further. Dr. Foster's report specifically commends Officer Henderson for recognizing the gravity of the situation and ensuring that all parties remained available for proper assessment. William continued. In her professional opinion, allowing any participant to leave before completing the evaluation would have been medically irresponsible and potentially dangerous for Charlotte's ongoing well-being. Marcus watched his superiors process this information, seeing their expressions shift from skepticism to recognition of the political minefield they were navigating. This was no longer just about protocol violations or complaints from the Queen Consort. This was about child welfare, medical necessity, and the protection of a vulnerable young girl from adults who might not have her best interests at heart. Commander Walsh cleared her throat. Your Royal Highness, we appreciate your perspective, but we still need to assess whether Officer Henderson's actions were within the scope of his authority. His authority comes from his duty to protect members of my family, William replied firmly. Last night, the greatest threat to my daughter's safety wasn't some external enemy. It was the behavior of adults who should have been protecting her. Officer Henderson recognized that threat and responded appropriately. The statement was a masterful piece of political maneuvering. William had reframed Marcus's actions from protocol violations into heroic protection duties, making it nearly impossible for the Protection Service to discipline him without appearing to side with those who had harmed a vulnerable child. Chief Inspector Morrison looked uncomfortable but pressed forward with his inquiry. Sir, the Queen Consort's complaint alleges that Officer Henderson acted beyond his authority and with personal bias. How do we address those accusations? William's expression hardened. The Queen Consort's complaint is an attempt to avoid accountability for behavior that caused significant harm to my daughter. Dr. Foster's report makes it clear that certain family members have been subjecting Charlotte to inappropriate pressure about her future role, pressure that has resulted in chronic anxiety and last night's collapse. He paused, allowing the implications to sink in. Officer Henderson didn't act with bias. He acted with appropriate concern for a child's well-being in the face of adult behavior that was clearly harmful and potentially abusive. Marcus realized that William was not just defending him, he was conducting a strategic counterattack against Camilla's complaint. By framing the issue as child protection rather than protocol adherence, he was forcing the Protection Service to choose between supporting their officer or appearing to side with someone who had emotionally harmed a young girl. The conversation was interrupted by another knock on the door. This time it was King Charles, accompanied by his private secretary and an expression that suggested he had come to resolve the situation definitively. The room suddenly felt very small as the current and future kings crowded into the security office with Marcus and his superior officers. Gentlemen, Charles said without preamble, I understand there are questions about Officer Henderson's actions last night. I've come to provide clarity on the palace's position regarding this matter. Commander Walsh and Chief Inspector Morrison came to attention, clearly recognizing that whatever Charles said would determine the outcome of their investigation. Marcus braced himself, uncertain whether the king had come to support him or to resolve the situation by sacrificing a troublesome security officer. I've reviewed Dr. Foster's medical report and consulted with my son about the circumstances surrounding my granddaughter's medical emergency. Charles continued. It's clear that Officer Henderson acted with appropriate judgment and in accordance with his fundamental duty to protect members of the royal family. The king's expression grew more serious. What's also clear is that certain individuals attempted to avoid accountability for their role in creating the circumstances that led to Charlotte's collapse. Officer Henderson's refusal to permit departures during the medical emergency ensured that proper assessment could take place and that appropriate interventions could be implemented. Charles looked directly at Marcus, his expression unreadable, but his tone carrying unmistakable authority. Officer Henderson demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment, integrity, and commitment to protection duties that we expect from the Specialist Protection Service. His actions last night may have prevented a much more serious crisis involving my granddaughter's psychological well-being. The endorsement was comprehensive and unambiguous. King Charles was not just defending Marcus's actions, he was praising them as exemplary. The complaint from Camilla had been effectively neutralized by the combined weight of medical evidence and royal approval. Commander Walsh seemed to recognize that the investigation was effectively over. Your Majesty, we appreciate your clarification. Based on your assessment in the medical report, it appears that Officer Henderson's actions were entirely appropriate under the circumstances. They were more than appropriate, Charles replied. They were necessary and commendable. I trust that will be reflected in any official record of these events. As the meeting concluded and Marcus's superiors prepared to leave, William approached him privately. The prince's expression was grateful but also concerned, as if he understood the personal cost that Marcus had paid for his integrity. Officer Henderson? William said quietly, I want you to know that Catherine and I are deeply grateful for what you did last night. Your actions protected our daughter when she needed it most, and we won't forget that. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of the night's events beginning to settle. He had kept his job and earned royal approval, but he also understood that his relationship with certain members of the family had been permanently altered. More importantly, he had witnessed things that would stay with him forever. Insights into family dynamics that few outsiders ever saw. As William prepared to return to Charlotte's bedside, he turned back to Marcus with one final comment. Things are going to change around here. Charlotte's well-being is going to be the priority, and anyone who can't accept that will need to adjust their expectations or find themselves excluded from her life. The message was clear. The events of the past 24 hours had shifted the balance of power within the royal family, and those who had been pressuring Charlotte would no longer have the access or influence they once enjoyed. Marcus had not just prevented one woman from leaving the building, he had helped trigger a fundamental reassessment of how the royal family treated its most vulnerable members. But as Marcus settled back into his duties, he knew that the consequences of his actions were far from over. Camilla's complaint had been defeated, but her resentment would likely endure. The changes that William had promised would create new tensions and conflicts within the family. And somewhere in the background, the media was beginning to ask questions about why the Queen Consort had been absent from several scheduled appearances following what had been described as a minor family gathering at Kensington Palace. The storm that Marcus had helped unleash was just beginning, and he would soon discover that protecting a child from emotional abuse was only the first challenge in a much larger battle for the soul of the royal family. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Marcus Henderson stood in the same entrance hall of Kensington Palace, watching Princess Charlotte laugh with genuine joy for the first time since he had known her. She was playing with a new puppy, a golden retriever named Biscuit, who had been Dr. Barrett, Foster's idea as part of Charlotte's ongoing therapy program. The transformation in the young princess was remarkable, but it had come at a cost that reverberated through every level of the royal family and British society. The immediate aftermath of that December night had been carefully managed by palace communications specialists who understood that the truth would be far more damaging than any carefully crafted narrative. The official story was that Princess Charlotte had experienced a minor medical episode during a family gathering, requiring routine observation and care. Dr. Foster's comprehensive report was classified as personal medical information, its contents known only to the immediate family and a handful of senior advisors. But within the walls of Kensington Palace, everything had changed. Charlotte's schedule had been dramatically reduced, with most public appearances cancelled or postponed indefinitely. Her education was restructured to focus on normal childhood development, rather than preparation for future royal duties. Most significantly, her interactions with certain family members were now carefully monitored and limited to situations where her parents could provide direct supervision. Camilla's role in Charlotte's life had been quietly but decisively curtailed. The Queen Consort still attended major family functions and state occasions, but she was no longer involved in discussions about the children's upbringing or future roles. Her attempts to maintain influence through King Charles had been politely but firmly rebuffed, as the king himself had apparently come to accept Dr. Foster's assessment of the situation. Marcus had watched these changes unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. Charlotte's recovery was everything he had hoped for, but the cost in family relationships was extensive. The royal family had effectively split into factions, with William and Catherine protecting their children's interests, while Charles navigated the impossible task of balancing his wife's wounded pride against his grandchildren's well-being. The media had eventually picked up fragments of the story, though never the complete truth. There had been speculation about family tensions, questions about Charlotte's reduced public profile, and persistent rumors about conflicts between William's household and Camilla's supporters. Royal correspondents wrote carefully worded pieces about differing views on child-rearing and generational approaches to royal duties, but none came close to revealing the reality of what had transpired. Marcus's own role in events had been entirely concealed from public view, a decision that protected both him and the family from uncomfortable questions about royal security protocols and internal conflicts. Officially, he remained a dedicated protection officer who had performed his duties admirably during a minor family crisis. Unofficially, he had become something unique in the history of royal service, a commoner who had successfully challenged royal authority in defense of a child's well-being. The long-term consequences of his actions continued to unfold in ways he never could have anticipated. Charlotte's therapy sessions had revealed not just the immediate triggers for her collapse, but a pattern of subtle psychological pressure that had been building for years. Dr. Foster's ongoing treatment plan included recommendations about family dynamics that essentially amounted to a blueprint for restructuring how the royal family approached the upbringing of its youngest members. William and Catherine had embraced these changes with the fervor of parents who finally had professional validation for their protective instincts. They hired additional child psychologists, restructured Charlotte and George's education programs, and began what amounted to a quiet revolution in how royal children were prepared for their future roles. The emphasis shifted from duty and obligation to emotional health and personal development. But the changes created new tensions throughout the royal system. Palace staff who had spent decades managing royal children according to traditional protocols found themselves retraining to accommodate new approaches that prioritize psychological well-being over institutional needs. Senior courtiers who had built careers on managing royal obligations struggled to adapt to a system where children's emotional health took precedence over ceremonial requirements. Marcus observed these transformations from his unique position as both an insider and an outsider. He continued his protection duties, but his relationship with the family had evolved beyond the typical boundaries between royals and their security detail. Charlotte trusted him in ways that went beyond professional respect, often seeking his reassuring presence during stressful situations. William and Catherine treated him as someone who had earned the right to their personal gratitude, occasionally consulting him on security matters that extended beyond his official responsibilities. The most dramatic change was in how Marcus himself was perceived within the protection service and the broader palace community. Word had spread, despite official secrecy, that he was the officer who had stood up to Camilla during Charlotte's medical crisis. The story had been embellished and mythologized in its retelling, but the core truth remained. Marcus Henderson had prioritized a child's welfare over royal privilege and had been vindicated at the highest levels. This reputation brought both benefits and complications. Younger protection officers looked up to him as an example of principled service, while some senior staff viewed him with suspicion as someone who had disrupted established hierarchies. His career prospects within the Royal Protection Service were secure, but he had also been marked as someone who would make difficult choices when institutional loyalty conflicted with moral obligations. The broader implications of Charlotte's case extended far beyond one family's internal dynamics. Dr. Foster had used her involvement to publish research on childhood stress in high-pressure environments, carefully anonymized but clearly informed by her royal experience. Her work had influenced policy discussions about child welfare in other contexts where institutional needs might conflict with children's emotional development. Educational specialists began questioning traditional approaches to preparing children for public roles, whether in politics, entertainment, or other high-profile families. The case study of Charlotte's recovery, while never explicitly identified, became a template for understanding how children could be protected from adult pressures, while still being prepared for their eventual responsibilities. Marcus found himself occasionally consulted by other protection agencies dealing with similar conflicts between institutional demands and child welfare. His reputation as someone who had successfully navigated these challenges made him a valuable resource for security professionals facing comparable ethical dilemmas. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence was the precedent that had been established within the royal family itself. Marcus's actions had demonstrated that royal privilege was not absolute, that there were circumstances where other considerations could and should take precedence. This principle, once established, began to influence decisions in other areas of royal life. Palace staff began to feel more empowered to raise concerns about practices that might be harmful to family members, particularly children. Medical professionals working with the royal family found their recommendations carrying more weight in discussions about schedules and obligations. Even senior advisors began factoring child welfare considerations into their strategic planning in ways that had been rare in previous generations. Charlotte's recovery became a symbol within the palace of what was possible when adult egos and institutional inertia were set aside in favor of a child's genuine needs. Her transformation from an anxious, overwhelmed young girl into a confident child who could enjoy normal developmental experiences provided powerful validation for the changes that had been implemented. As Marcus watched Charlotte play with Biscuit in the palace gardens, he reflected on the unexpected trajectory his career had taken. He had joined royal protection expecting to guard against external threats, but his most significant contribution had been recognizing and addressing a threat that came from within the very institution he was meant to protect. The night he had refused to let Camilla leave Kensington Palace had lasted only a few hours, but its consequences would likely influence the royal family for generations. Charlotte would grow up in an environment that prioritized her psychological health over ceremonial obligations. Future royal children would benefit from protocols and safeguards that ensured their emotional well-being was protected, even when it conflicted with institutional traditions. Dr. Foster had once told Marcus that his actions might have prevented a much more serious crisis, but he now understood that the implications went beyond Charlotte's individual case. He had helped establish principles that could protect other vulnerable members of the royal family from similar pressures and abuse. The precedent he had set would make it easier for future protection officers to make difficult choices when duty demanded standing against royal authority rather than blindly supporting it. Marcus's personal cost had been significant but manageable. His relationship with Camilla remained formally polite but fundamentally altered, with both understanding that their interaction that night had revealed incompatible views about child welfare and accountability. His career had survived and even flourished, but he carried the weight of knowledge about family dynamics that few outsiders possessed. The transformation of Charlotte from a distressed, anxious child into a happy, confident young girl provided daily validation that his choices had been correct. When she smiled at him during their routine interactions, Marcus was reminded that sometimes the most important battles were fought not against dramatic external threats, but against the quiet, persistent pressures that could destroy a child's spirit if left unchecked. As spring turned to summer, Marcus continued his duties with the knowledge that he had fundamentally altered the trajectory of one of the world's most important families. The guard who had stood his ground on that cold December night had done more than prevent one woman from leaving a building. He had protected a vulnerable child, challenged institutional abuse of power, and established principles that would influence royal child-rearing for generations to come. The story that began with a collapse in a palace reception room had evolved into a quiet revolution in how the royal family approached its most sacred responsibility, nurturing and protecting its children. And at the center of that transformation stood a former soldier whose commitment to protecting the innocent had proved stronger than centuries of royal tradition and institutional pressure. In protecting Charlotte, Marcus Henderson had not just saved one child. He had helped save the royal family from its own worst impulses, ensuring that future generations would grow up in an environment where love and emotional health mattered more than duty and obligation. It was perhaps the most important victory of his career, even though the world would never know the full story of the guard who stood his ground when it mattered most.